I still remember the feeling of the cold steel doorknob under my hand, just before I knocked. Apartment 814. 8th floor. Upscale building in downtown Portland, the kind with a doorman and polished marble. It was a place Isabella had always dreamed of living. And there I was, Caleb, a food delivery driver in a beat-up jacket, about to hand over 2 expensive entrees and a bottle of wine. Julian Miller answered. And the way his eyes widened, just for a split second, before he composed himself, that was enough. It was a flash of surprise, then something worse, something like pity mixed with a flicker of amusement. He didn't say anything at first, just reached out for the bag. Then, from behind him, Isabella's voice, bright and curious, "Who is it, honey?" And then she stepped into view. The moment her eyes met mine, her face just drained of all color. Standing there, in my delivery uniform with the logo glaring, holding their receipt, it was like the air was sucked out of the entire building. For a second, no one moved. We were frozen, caught in this horrifying, silent tableau. Behind them, I could see into their apartment, exposed brick, modern furniture, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Exactly the kind of place I'd once promised Isabella we'd have someday. Julian broke the silence first. "Have a good night," he said, his tone not quite mocking, but not kind either. It was the tone you use for the help. He pressed a crisp $20 bill into my hand as a tip. Isabella, she just stood there, hand over her mouth, eyes wide and unblinking. And in that moment, I knew. She wasn't going to acknowledge me. She wasn't going to defend me. She was just going to watch. I took the 20. "Thank you," I said, "because that's what you do, right? You say thank you." Then I turned and walked back to the elevator, feeling like I'd been completely gutted. You know, the worst part wasn't that they saw me like that, delivering their fancy dinner in my worn-out jacket. It was Isabella's silence. Again. Just like she'd been silent when her parents tore me down. Just like she'd been silent at that dinner party when I was just a prop. And in that elevator, going down, I finally understood who she truly was. But how did I get there? How did a guy who built AI-powered automation tools end up delivering food to the very people who dismissed him? Well, it started 4 years earlier. I was Caleb, 29, pouring my life into a startup, working 16-hour days in a cramped apartment, building software to streamline workflow processes for small businesses. I was passionate, I could explain complex algorithms, and Isabella, who was 26 when we met, working in marketing, said she loved that about me. Her parents, though? Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, they were a different story. Old money. The kind of family where your last name is a golden key and reputation matters more than innovation. They were too classy to call me trash to my face. But every single interaction felt like a test I was constantly failing. Her dad would ask what I did, and when I'd say AI automation, he'd smile this tight, dismissive smile and ask if I meant like chatbots, as if my life's work was some trivial side project. Her mom was worse, always talking about stability, planning for the future, asking Isabella if she'd thought about where we'd live, how we'd afford children. Every question was a quiet drumbeat, "He can't provide," it made my teeth ache. Isabella would always defend me afterward, tell me her parents were just old-fashioned, that they'd come around once I got funding. That love was what mattered. I was stupid enough to believe her. After 3 years, I saved up for 6 months to buy a ring that wasn't huge, but wasn't cheap either. And in that same apartment where I coded until 3 in the morning, she said yes, crying happy tears. For a while, everything felt fine. We were planning a small wedding, talking about getting a place. Normal couple stuff. But her parents' comments grew more frequent, more pointed. When Isabella mentioned we were waiting until my software launched, her mom would go quiet in this loaded way that just spoke volumes. And her dad? He started bringing up guys from their social circle, guys like Julian Miller, always mentioning their partnerships at law firms or their positions at investment banks. Isabella would just nod politely, and I'd sit there feeling like a ghost. The real breaking point, though, wasn't a dramatic blow-up. It was 6 months after the engagement. Isabella had invited me to dinner at her parents' house. I got there early, let myself in through the side door like I'd done countless times. I could hear voices in the study, her parents, and Isabella. I was about to announce myself when I heard my name. Her dad was talking, his voice calm, measured, like he was discussing a business deal. He was telling Isabella that I was nice, probably talented, but potential doesn't pay mortgages. I froze in the hallway, my hand still on the doorknob. Then her mom chimed in, saying they didn't raise Isabella to struggle, that she deserved someone established, someone who could give her the life she was used to. My heart was pounding. I waited for Isabella to defend me, to tell them they were being unfair. Instead, she said quietly, "I know, Mom. I know. I just thought he'd have real traction by now." Something in my chest just cracked. Her dad continued, talking about how love doesn't pay for weddings or houses or private schools, how she shouldn't settle. Her mom brought up Julian Miller again, specifically how he'd made junior partner at a major corporate law firm at 30. That name stuck in my head like a splinter. I backed out quietly, texted Isabella that something came up with the code, and drove home in complete silence. I didn't confront her that night. I just sat at my desk, staring at lines of code, and realized I'd been auditioning for a role I was never going to get. 2 weeks later, Isabella's mom called. Invited us to a small family dinner. Her voice was sugary in a way that made my skin crawl. I almost said no, but Isabella looked so hopeful, like maybe this was them finally accepting us. So, I put on a button-down shirt and showed up. Julian was there, sitting in the living room like he belonged. Perfectly styled hair, a watch that probably cost more than my entire apartment. Isabella's mom introduced him as an old family friend. He shook my hand with this firm grip that lasted just a second too long. Dinner was excruciating. Her dad asked Julian about his cases, his clients, his firm's latest merger. Julian answered with an easy confidence that made me feel like a kid at the adults' table. Every time I tried to contribute, the topic would just shift. And Isabella? She just sat there, smiling politely, not noticing, or not caring, that her parents were conducting a live comparison. At one point, her dad turned to me and asked about my launch timeline. Before I could even answer, her mom cut in, talking about how Julian just closed a deal worth 6 figures. Julian had the decency to look slightly embarrassed, but not enough to actually deflect. I excused myself early, mumbled something about debugging. Isabella walked me to the door. I asked her point-blank if she knew Julian would be there. She hesitated. Just long enough for me to know the answer was yes. She touched my arm, told me it was just dinner, not to read into it. But I was already reading into it. I was reading the whole damn book. The breakup happened 3 days later, in her apartment, late at night. I'd spent 72 hours barely sleeping. She started by saying, "We need to talk," and I knew. I already knew. But I let her say it anyway. "I love you, Caleb. I really do. But I need stability. I need to know we're going to be okay. And I can't keep waiting for someday." Her voice cracked on that last word, like she was the one being hurt. I asked if this was about Julian. She looked away. Answer enough. She started to say something about what her parents thought, and I cut her off. "Is this their thinking, Isabella, or your thinking?" She went quiet. Then she slid the ring off her finger, that ring I'd worked overtime for, and placed it on the coffee table between us like it was evidence in a trial. She told me she needed more than dreams, needed someone who was already there. I stood up. I couldn't sit there anymore. "You didn't choose a better man, Isabella," I said, not yelling, just stating a fact. "You chose safety." And I walked out. 2 days later, my buddy Jake sent me a screenshot. Isabella and Julian, on Instagram, his arm around her shoulders. The caption, "Found my forever," with a heart emoji. I stared at that photo for a long time before I deleted all my social media. The universe has a sick sense of humor. I learned that the hard way when my startup crashed 3 months after Isabella left. And I ended up delivering food to her and her perfect new boyfriend. People talk about rock bottom like it's one moment, one bad day. But it's not. It's a slow slide. Every week, something else breaks, and you just keep falling. After the breakup, I threw myself into work, spent 18-hour days coding and pitching, telling myself I'd show them all. I'd build something so successful they'd choke on their judgments. I got close, too. 2 potential investors interested. Meetings scheduled. Term sheets being drafted. Then the first investor backed out, said the market was too crowded. The second investor ghosted me completely after 3 months of stringing me along. By the time I realized what was happening, I'd burned through my savings keeping the servers running, paying for tools I couldn't afford. My landlord wanted rent I didn't have. My credit cards were maxed. I had to shut everything down. I tried to pivot, tried to salvage some of the code, but without funding, there was no path forward. Jake told me I could crash at his place. I moved in with 2 duffel bags and a laptop. Everything I owned fitting in the bed of my truck. I needed money fast. Any money. So I signed up for food delivery apps, the kind where you drive around for 12 hours and make maybe $100 if you're lucky. It was humiliating in ways I can't fully describe. Going from building AI systems to hauling burgers and Chinese takeout. But pride doesn't pay bills, and I was drowning. I worked nights mostly, drove through the same neighborhoods where Isabella and I used to go on dates. Every street corner felt like a ghost. Jake never made me feel bad about it, just split his groceries with me and pretended not to notice when I couldn't chip in for rent. 3 months into this new life, I was numb, running on autopilot. And then that night came. The delivery to apartment 814. After I left their apartment, I drove back to Jake's place and sat in my truck for an hour. Not crying. Not angry. Just empty. Jake found me there eventually, asked what happened. I told him everything. He offered to go egg their apartment, which would have been funny if I wasn't so tired. Instead, I went inside. I opened my laptop for the first time in weeks, and I started deleting things. Every digital trace of the life I'd tried to build. Jake asked what I was doing. I don't want revenge, I told him. I want out. And I meant it. I was done trying to prove anything to anyone. Done chasing some fantasy of showing up Isabella and her family. Done letting them live rent-free in my head. That night was a turning point. Not because anything got better immediately, but because I stopped performing for an invisible audience. The AI startup thing was dead. I'd burned every bridge with investors, didn't have the credibility to start over in that space. So, I needed something completely different. I started small. Really small. Taking contract work, doing basic website maintenance and IT support for local businesses. It wasn't glamorous. A lot of password resets, printer issues. But it was steady, and it was mine. I advertised on local community boards, charged reasonable rates, and showed up on time, which, apparently, put me ahead of half the competition. After 6 months, I'd saved enough to move into my own place. Nothing fancy, a studio apartment above a dry cleaner in Portland, but it had 4 walls and a door that locked. I didn't have to apologize to anyone for existing. Jake threw me a housewarming party, just him and 2 other friends, with pizza and cheap beer. It felt more real than any of the fancy dinners at the Sterling House ever had. But something kept gnawing at me during those contract jobs. I kept seeing the same problem over and over, small businesses drowning in manual processes, spending hours on tasks that could be automated, but couldn't afford enterprise solutions. That's when it clicked. The AI tools I'd built before were aimed too high, trying to compete with the big players. But there was a massive underserved market right in front of me. I started coding again, but different this time. Building lightweight automation tools specifically for small and mid-sized companies. Things that could integrate with their existing systems without requiring a complete overhaul. I kept my contract work during the day to pay bills, coded at night. Within 6 months, I had a working product. I called it Flowforge AI, focused on document processing and workflow automation, and priced it at a point where small businesses could actually afford it. My first client was a local accounting firm manually entering data from hundreds of invoices every month. My tool cut their processing time by 70%. That led to referrals, which led to more clients. Within a year, I had enough recurring revenue to quit the contract work. I brought on a partner, a guy named Mark, who'd been doing business development for decades. We started targeting mid-sized companies, the kind too small for the enterprise giants, but too big for manual processes. The irony wasn't lost on me that a lot of our clients were in professional services, law firms, consulting agencies, the exact world that had rejected me. 2 years after that night at apartment 814, Flowforge AI was processing millions of documents monthly. We had 20 employees. I'd moved into an actual house with an office where I could work without sitting on my bed. Success is weird when it finally shows up, because it doesn't feel like the movies. There's no dramatic moment where everything clicks. It's just a series of small wins that eventually add up to something you didn't expect. Flowforge AI became one of the fastest-growing automation platforms in the region. We'd been featured in 2 major tech publications, and venture capital firms that had ghosted me years earlier were suddenly returning my calls. I bought a small house, nothing extravagant, but mine. With an actual home office and space to think. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't worried about money. I met someone, too. Her name was Chloe. She worked as a physical therapist and had zero interest in status or impressing anyone. She'd reached out because her clinic needed help streamlining their patient intake process, and we just clicked. She knew about Isabella. I told her the whole story on our 3rd date because I figured she deserved to know what she was getting into. She just shrugged and said people who choose based on their parents' opinions usually end up miserable. Anyway, we'd been together for 8 months when the universe decided to remind me that karma doesn't forget anyone. I was at a tech conference downtown, the kind of industry event where founders and investors network. Mark had convinced me to take a booth to showcase our latest features. We were getting decent attention. Several companies wanted demos, and I was talking to a potential client when I saw them across the exhibition hall. Isabella and Julian. Dressed like they were at a fundraiser gala instead of a tech conference. They looked so out of place, it was almost funny. Julian saw me first. Did this weird double take like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He said something to Isabella, pointed in my direction. I watched her face change as she recognized me. Watched her scan the crowd, our booth, the banner with Flowforge AI's logo and our client list. I could see her doing the math in her head. They didn't come over right away, just kind of hovered at a distance. And I went back to my conversation like they weren't there, because honestly, they weren't important anymore. That potential client turned into an actual client, signed a contract for a full implementation. By the time I finished the paperwork, Isabella was standing at the edge of our booth. She looked different. Still beautiful, but tired in a way I couldn't quite place, like someone who'd been smiling for too long. She asked if she could talk to me. I almost said no. But Chloe had taught me that closure sometimes means letting people say what they need to say. So, I told Mark I'd be back in 5 minutes and walked with Isabella to a quieter corner of the hall. She started with small talk, asked how I'd been, said the company looked incredible. I just waited. I knew she hadn't pulled me aside to discuss automation workflows. Finally, she got to it. Told me she'd made a mistake, that she'd listened to her parents instead of her heart, that she'd chosen security over happiness, and had been paying for it ever since. I asked what she meant. She admitted that Julian wasn't who she thought he was. That the pressure of maintaining his image had made him controlling and distant. That her parents still weren't satisfied, because nothing was ever enough for them. Then she mentioned something that made the pieces click. Julian's firm had been struggling. They'd lost several major clients to more efficient competitors, and he'd been passed over for senior partner twice now. She looked at me with these desperate eyes and said, "I should have believed in us, Caleb. I should have waited." And I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction. Just a kind of distant sadness for the person she could have been. I told her that was her choice to make, that she'd chosen the path she thought was safe, and now she had to live with it. She started to say something about second chances, about how we'd been good together once. I stopped her there. Told her gently, but firmly, that I was with someone now, someone who'd never asked me to be anything other than myself, and that I was happy in a way I'd never been with her. You didn't just choose Julian, Isabella. You chose your parents' approval over building something real. And that's something I can't fix for you. Her face crumpled a little. She asked if I hated her. I told her honestly that I didn't, that I'd stopped thinking about her years ago. Somehow, that seemed to hurt her more than anger would have. We stood there for another minute in awkward silence. Then she thanked me for talking to her and walked back to where Julian was waiting, looking annoyed and checking his phone. The real irony came 2 weeks later. Julian's firm reached out to Mark about a potential partnership. They wanted to integrate Flowforge AI into their document management system. Said they were losing clients because their processes were too slow and outdated. Mark brought me the inquiry with this knowing look, and I had to laugh at the cosmic joke of it all. Julian Miller's law firm, the same firm that represented everything the Sterlings valued, was now coming to me for help because they couldn't keep up with the market. I thought about it for exactly 5 seconds before I told Mark to decline politely. Said we were focused on clients who'd supported us from the beginning, not ones who only showed up when they were desperate. Mark didn't argue. He just sent a professional response, referring them to our competitors. A few days later, Mr. Sterling called the office directly. Mark transferred it to me before I could stop him. Isabella's dad used his business voice, the smooth one he probably used with everyone. Talked about how impressive our growth had been, how he'd been following our success, asked if we'd reconsider working with Julian's firm. I let him finish, let him compliment my business acumen. Then I very politely told him that we had a full client roster and were being selective about new partnerships. He offered premium rates, expedited payments, whatever we needed. I could hear the desperation creeping into his voice, the realization that he was asking for a favor from someone he'd once considered beneath his daughter. Chloe asked me later if I felt vindicated, if turning them down felt like justice. I had to think about it. The truth was, it didn't feel like anything dramatic. It just felt like closing a door that should have been closed years ago. I'd spent 2 years thinking about them, another 2 years not thinking about them. And now they were back asking for help, and I simply didn't owe them anything. They wanted someone who was already successful, I told Chloe. I became successful without them, and that's the whole point. She kissed me and said that was the right answer, and we went back to planning our weekend trip, something simple and normal in ours. Isabella tried reaching out one more time, about a month later. I saw a message request from a new account, but I didn't open it. Just archived it without reading, because whatever she had to say wasn't going to change anything. The Sterlings stopped calling. Julian's firm found some other solution, and my life continued forward without them in it. 6 months after that tech conference, I heard through the industry grapevine that Julian had left his firm. Something about the partners pushing him out after too many blown opportunities. And apparently, the Sterlings were not taking it well. But by then, I was already on to the next thing, expanding Flowforge AI into new markets, planning a future with Chloe, and living a life where their approval had never mattered less. What would you have done in my position?